So today we're going to be looking at antebellum literature. Remember, the word antebellum just means before the Civil War. So we're going to be looking at how literature during this time period connects kind of with what's going on during the time period. Again, you're going to see a lot of cross connections between this and your English class. But remember, in English class, you're looking at the literary background. Here, we're looking more at the historical background, why the writers are actually writing about what they are. So we're going to start off with a movement, a literary movement called Transcendentalism. Long word, sure you heard it in English. You're kind of rolling your eyes right now. But there's a reason why we talk about this in American history. Basically, Transcendentalism is this movement where there are these people who believe that the Industrial Revolution and all the materialistic desires in society have corrupted people. It's made people bad and evil. And that's not good because people are inherently good. And so, how can we return back to our goodness? Transcendentalists will say, well, all you have to do is shed your material objects, shed all your modern worries about your paycheck and your job and materialism, and return to nature. And by living in nature, you can be self-reliant, you can connect back with Christianity, and you can really find out what life is about rather than relying on all of these, consumeristic, materialistic kind of things. So Transcendentalism is really a type of Romanticism. Remember from 501, Romanticism is a movement that connects man with nature. There's not really religious undertones there, but Transcendentalism would be a type of Romanticism that does have a lot of Christianity elements. So man is connecting with nature, but he's using God or he's using religion to do that. So two famous Transcendentalists are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So Ralph Waldo Emerson is probably the biggest transcendentalist of the time period. He wrote a lot of different books and essays, but his most famous series of essays was called Self-Reliance. In Self-Reliance, he's basically saying that it's your personal responsibility to be in charge of if you go to heaven or hell. So as you're living your life, make sure you're living it in a way that is reflective of the person that you want to be. And then his student, Henry David Thoreau, again, also wrote a lot of stuff, but he was probably most famous for writing Walden, which was a book about a few years that he lived in the woods near Walden Pond, actually on a property that was owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And when Thoreau was living there, he built himself this little log cabin where he literally shed all of his possessions, just lived in this log cabin for a few years, and wrote about his experiences in Walden. Another thing that Henry David Thoreau is really famous for is practicing civil disobedience, which is basically refusing to follow laws that you believe are not just. And the word civil here really means that you're doing it peacefully, you're not doing it violently. Civil disobedience is probably most associated with Martin Luther King Jr. and other types of nonviolent activists. But it became popular, or at least noticed, when Henry David Thoreau did it. A really good example was during the Mexican-American War that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Thoreau believed that it was being fought largely just to expand slavery in the West, and as an abolitionist, Thoreau did not want to support the expansion of slavery. So in protest, he refused to pay his taxes to the government because he believed the government was supporting slavery. So that's an example of civil disobedience, again, used a lot throughout history, just we can definitely see Thoreau using it. We also see Transcendentalism reflected in the development of what were called utopian communities. So utopian is just a word that means perfect or ideal. So these are going to be little communities that are in theory self-reliant. They don't really connect with mainstream society, they are literally removed from society, usually on land that is away from large cities. It's a rural area where these little communities will set up buildings and houses and whatever way that they're going to kind of make their lifestyle. Generally, the goal of these communities was to shed aspects of modern society. So you can kind of see transcendentalism there, trying to shed materialism and stuff like that. A lot of them have religious undertones. A lot of them were different sects of Christianity. Two famous utopian communities were the Shakers and the Mormons. Both of those were Christian sects. The Shakers were known for making furniture, and they also were very small in numbers because it was hard to recruit to their church. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the Mormons also, we'll talk about them a little bit later as well. They are one of the few utopian communities that actually survives this time period, because out of the hundreds of the utopian communities of the 1800s, almost all of them failed, mostly because they didn't really know how to be truly self-reliant. And even the ones that succeeded, like the Mormons or even the Shakers to an extent, had to do something to connect with the outside world. Like the Shakers made furniture that they sold to mainstream society, or the Mormons had, jobs or at least other type of economic means that connected them to the outside society. So now we're going to look at another type of Romanticism at the time. Just like Transcendentalism is a type of Romanticism, so is something called Dark Romanticism. So this is also a 19th century or 1800 literary movement, but it believes that people and nature are evil and destructive, and that there is no salvation. So if you want to call like the Transcendentalists the hippies of the 1800s, the Dark Romantics are kind of like the emo kids, or like the goths of the 1800s, you could say. I have three famous authors here, and each one of them wrote a lot of different books and sometimes short stories and things like that. These aren't the only Dark Romantic authors, but these are probably the three most famous that really showed the different themes of Dark Romanticism. So Edgar Allan Poe, his most famous works are The Raven and The Telltale Heart. Both of those are about overwhelming sadness and guilt that eventually drive the main character crazy, in a sense. The Telltale Heart is a really good short story. I have a link here. You can look at it in the notes for a little like animated cartoon of the story. But basically this guy ends up killing, I think like his older landlord. He chops him up and buries him underneath his floorboards. But the guilt of the murder starts to kind of drive the guy crazy to the point where he's imagining that he can hear this man's heart beating underneath the floorboards. So you definitely see some dark tones or dark undertones there. Nathaniel Hawthorne, his most famous book is called The Scarlet Letter. Down here, it's about Puritan New England, and if you think all the way back to Unit 1 and about Puritans, like they're pretty strict people. They're not the most accepting or tolerant people. I'm sure it was a pretty difficult community to live in. In this story, there's a woman right here. She has a baby with a married man that she is not married to, and her punishment is to be banished from the town, and she has to live on the outskirts of town with her baby, and then on her clothing she has to wear a big red A, and the A stands for adulterer, or adultery is like cheating on your spouse. And so she is literally marked with this letter that makes people not like her. And then another famous book, an author at the time was Herman Melville. He wrote Moby Dick, about the struggle between man and a whale, more symbolizing just like how humans think that they can control nature, but nature is so powerful it will always beat humans every time. So again, not really talking about how nature is necessarily evil, but just how like men are stupid to think that they can control nature. And the last one we're going to look at, the last author or movement, is a series of books on abolition. And the most famous one of these by far is a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, this was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, and it's a fictional book written about several families that owned slaves. But the whole point of it is really to highlight the cruelty of slavery, and that slavery is a sin no matter what. In the book, some of the slaves are treated well, some of them are treated poorly, and she really tries to make this point that, even if Southerners believe that they're treating their slaves nicely, it's still slavery, and it's still a sin. And when this book is published, it becomes like a bestseller. The North loves it. They use it as more fuel for the abolition movement. So you have increased calls to end slavery. The South is like, it's fake news, it's all made up, this woman doesn't know what she's talking about. They burn the book, they destroy it. So really what you see coming out of Uncle Tom's Cabin is more sectionalism, right? This buzzword that we're going to use constantly throughout this unit to talk about the division of the country, mostly over slavery debates. Actually, there's this quote, there's some debate on whether or not it's true, but apparently when Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, he told her, so you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war. So that is, how influential her book was and how much sectionalism it actually caused.